As we begin exploring the idea of Python for data analysis or data visualization, we're going to want a tool that suits that purpose a little better than what we're used to. And the tool we're going to use is called Jupyter Notebook. Up until this point, you have probably been using what I would consider kind of a traditional IDE, something like Visual Studio Code or PyCharm or Eclipse or one of the many, many others that are out there. And ultimately, all of those are really just text editors. They make our code look pretty on the screen. They help us find errors a little bit easier. They help us manage our files, and they make it easy to execute our code, right? But when it all comes down to it, source code is just text. And the workflow is, I'm going to open my editor, I'm going to type in my code, and I'm going to run it and debug it and modify it. And I'm working towards ultimately finishing this program or script that either I'm going to use myself or maybe I'm going to share it for other folks to use. A traditional IDE works very well for that. Sometimes the source code, the projects are big and complex and multiple files and all of that. IDEs are really helpful for managing all of that. When we start using Python for analytics and for data analysis, I should say, and for visualization of data, our needs are a little bit different. Instead of having these big, giant chunks of source code, we're really going to be dealing most of the time with little snippets of code that are really intended to just interact with some data and to produce some visuals that can help us understand that data that we're looking at. So smaller chunks of code, probably a more visual approach than the console apps that we're used to. And that's where Jupyter Notebook comes in. There are other products like this out there, but Jupyter Notebook is very popular. There are lots of videos and web pages that you can use for resources. And it's just a good choice for us to begin looking at data analysis. Project Jupyter is the name of the folks that put this together and maintain it. And their website is jupyter.org. You can see the spelling there is a nod to the Python programming language. And of course, it has installation instructions and information. And you could get started doing that. But as it turns out, in addition to Jupyter Notebooks, we're going to also need, we're going to have use for a lot of other tools that are going to be helpful for us. And so for most people, the easiest way to get started with all of this is to install Anaconda. So this is anaconda.com. Anaconda is an open source distribution of Python that bundles with it a lot of useful packages and modules for people who are doing data analysis. And one of the things that it includes is Jupyter Notebook. It's a paid program for people who are using it professionally, but it does have a free version for individuals like us, and obviously that's what we're going to do. And so we can click on the free download link, and it should detect your operating system and offer to give you the correct download version. If it didn't, you can click get additional installers. I have a separate video for installing this on Windows that you can jump over there. And I don't deal with Linux in this course, but there is a version of this for Linux. If you want to see all those choices, you can click there. With Mac, the only thing we need to pay attention to is that we live in a world now where there are sort of two categories of Mac computers. The older Macs use an Intel chip, and newer ones use Apple Silicon, which at the time of this recording, there's M1, M2, and M3. If you have a newer Mac, then you might have an M1 or an M2 or an M3, and you'll want to install that one. I'm on a school computer, and we're on a community college budget, so I don't have a fancy M3 machine. I've still got this old MacBook Pro using an Intel chip, so I'm going to click on that one to download it. And this will be a similar experience to other Mac installations you've done. It's got to download the software first. I'm going to cut the video here so that you don't have to wait for that. All right, so the installation package has finished downloading, and I'm going to go ahead and execute that now. This will be similar in terms of experience. This will be similar to other Mac applications that you've installed, but I'm going to open that little package file here. and I'm okay with running that. We're going to be okay with pretty much the default settings here. Got to accept the license and all of that fun stuff. You can change the location of where it gets installed. I'm fine with where it is. You might be prompted to enter a username and password here so that you can have access to install. Okay, and then it's going to kind of grind away and install all those files. I will cut the video again here. All right, that snuck up on me. It finished, and it actually started loading stuff in the background before I could hit the record button again. The installer, the package that we used to install this is wrapping up, so I'll go ahead and just close that. I don't need the getting started stuff. And now that I'm done, I can move that to the trash. It is a good chance that when you first run this, you will get this little update notification. So what it has run for me is called the Anaconda Navigator, and it's kind of like a main menu or a launch pad for a bunch of the stuff that comes in the Anaconda sort of bundle. And if it ran it automatically, but you can run it just like any other app. It put it right at the end for me. It's got that little green circular logo. I'm not going to make you watch me update, but you probably will want to update that. And then it's asking me about signing in so that I can host notebooks in the cloud. I'm not particularly interested in that. This shows me all the stuff that I've got installed here, and there'll be a lot of familiar names on here, right? The two that we're interested in at the moment is Jupyter Notebook and possibly Jupyter Lab. And so Jupyter Notebook, again, it's somewhat confusing because Notebook is the app, and then when we create a file, it's also called a notebook. Jupyter Lab we can think of it as kind of an improved version of Jupyter Notebook. It's got a much nicer user interface, essentially, but it opens the same files, and I think probably if you're really going to use a Jupyter product, you'll probably want to spend your time in Jupyter Lab. But I'm actually going to be working on my Jupyter Notebooks inside Visual Studio, so I'm not really worried about Jupyter Lab. I just want to show Notebook so that you can get a sense of what it looks like and give you some context before we jump over to Visual Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. It is going to, it has to kind of start up some stuff here, but it is going to eventually launch in a web browser. It is a web-based application. It uses a browser for the user interface, and that sort of gives the appearance that it's running maybe on the internet. But unless you specifically tell it that you want to do that and you connect it to some server, it's actually just running on your local machine, right? It's just using a web browser to help with the user interface. And I had a little technical glitch where I wasn't recording, or my recording stopped, I guess, in the middle. So I'm a little bit disorganized here, right? A little bit messed up. So once Jupyter Notebook opens, you'll be in a web browser. And this is on my local machine. You can see the web address up there is not an online web address. It's just a local server that's running. And I'm looking essentially at my file structure on my computer. And so the first thing I need to do is either open or create a Jupyter Notebook file. I'm going to go into my Documents folder. And I had already, because I lost my recording or part of my recording, I had already created a folder there. But if you need to create one, you can use the New button and create a new folder. I just called mine Jupyter Notebooks. Oh, and I just missed. And no file's in here yet, but I'm going to go ahead and create a notebook file. And I will rename this. I'll call it First Notebook. It has the extension IPYNB, and I'll click the check mark to accept that, and now I'll double click on that to open it. So that was a Jupyter Notebook file that I created, and now I am in the Jupyter Notebook app looking at that file. The basic idea here, I'm not going to get too deep into this because I think, as I mentioned, I'm going to actually be doing my work on Jupyter Notebook files in Visual Studio. And so I'll be switching over there in a few minutes, but I wanted to at least give you kind of a quick look at what Jupyter Notebook as an application looks like. The basic idea with Jupyter Notebook files is that they are built on cells. And so this is a cell, and a cell can contain either Python code or Markdown. Okay, we'll look at Markdown in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and click here and type some Python code. I'm old school and also just old, so I'm going to do a hello world program. And it's not just one line of code. I can write multiple lines of code. And when I'm ready to execute that, there is an execute button here, a run. This will run the individual cell I am looking at. I can stop. It's kind of running now. I can stop that if I want. I can kind of restart if I want. And this it looks like a fast forward button to me, but the two arrows will kind of rerun all of the code in your whole notebook file. So it has executed my code, and it prints out the output just immediately below it. And so that output is kind of associated with the cell where I wrote the code. If I make a change to that, let's say I add an exclamation mark there, it's not live in the sense that it doesn't update immediately. I have to run this cell again, and it will update my output. And since this run button also kind of moves you to the next cell, there is no next cell, so it created one for me. But I can go back and edit that, add another exclamation mark there, and run it. It updates my output, and now we're in the next cell. Let's change this one to a Markdown cell. Now, Markdown is a syntax for essentially like live rich text, I guess you should say. I about said live text, rich text. You can think of it as the analogy of being like HTML. So it gives us a way, if I want to put some text in here, if I want to give this sort of a title, first notebook, I'll say my first notebook. And if I hit run, it just prints that out. And if I double click on it, I can edit it again. But Markdown lets me add symbols and Markdown symbols to change the appearance. And so you would probably call this a hashtag. That is the pound symbol. And if I add a pound symbol, that makes this a heading. And so it makes it nice and big. If I want it a heading, but not quite that big, I can put two pound symbols there, and it renders it just a little bit smaller. I don't personally know a lot of Markdown. I don't use it very often, and when I do, I just have a reference next to me that I look it up. There are lots of great resources on Markdown out there. You might have used this a little bit with GitHub at some point to create a README file. But because I don't use it frequently, I don't remember the syntax. I just know a couple of the more common ones. So this is my first time with a Jupyter Notebook. It's not actually, because in fact, it's not even my first time doing this because I just lost my recording of doing the exact same thing. It looks fun. And so if I render that, there we go. Again, double click. And if I want to say my first time if I want to emphasize that, Jupyter Notebook, I can use asterisk, and that will italicize it. And if I want to emphasize something even more, I could do 2 of those asterisks, and that should make it bold. And now I can create additional cells if I want. I can also use the icons over here to add a cell below or above. I can make a copy of a cell if I want, and I can delete a cell. All that sort of basic editing functionality that you would expect. And again, because I'm going to be switching over to Visual Studio Code, I'm not going to really go any deeper than just this. I would again mention that if you are going to work with Jupyter outside of Visual Studio Code, you probably are going to want to learn Jupyter Labs, which I don't use, but seems to have a much nicer and more modern user interface. So you might want to look at that. But I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio Code now and look at how I can work on this notebook there. All right, so the first thing I'll do is I'll save this, and I'm going to go ahead and just close all of Safari since it was running in Safari. And I also have the Anaconda Navigator running, so I'm going to go ahead and close that as well because I don't need that open. I'm switching over to Visual Studio. Now I'm assuming that you have Visual Studio Code installed and that you've got it all set for basic Python development. In other words, you've got the Python extension installed, you've got Python distribution so you can interpret and execute your code. If you haven't done those things, you're going to want to stop and go take care of that first. Now, Visual Studio Code has native support for Jupyter Notebook files, but there is an extension that will give us that'll give us kind of all the goodness of Visual Studio Code with Jupyter Notebooks. You can see that little number, by the way, means I have some updates that are some things that need to be reloaded. I'm not going to worry about those at the moment. I'm going to go, so I've clicked on the extensions icon there, and I'm going to just type Jupyter. And you can see that there are a handful of extensions available that are related to Jupyter Notebooks. And I just want the basic one, the main one, and I'm looking to make sure that it's Microsoft and that it's verified to be the one that I want. I've got it installed already, so you don't see any user interface for that here, but you will have an install button. You're going to install it just like any other extension pack. When you're done, you're going to land on a start page, and I'm actually going to just start with Visual Studio the way that I typically start in Visual Studio, which is I open a folder. So I'm going to go to the File, Open Folder on the menu, and I'm going to navigate to that folder that I made for Jupyter Notebooks, and I'm going to open that. And so at this point, I can now click on my first notebook, and it opens. It looks very similar in a broad sense. It looks very similar to the Jupyter Notebook app. The user interface is a little bit different. I've got a Run All button up here. I've got buttons to add cells. I can add a code cell or a markdown cell. All right, and it's just going to insert that wherever wherever I have a cell selected. If I want to edit a markdown cell, I just double click on it and I can edit, and then I'm going to click the check mark when I am done editing that, and then I can edit my code, and I have an execute button right next to it. So if I add some exclamation marks because I'm really excited about my Jupyter Notebook, then I can execute that. And the first time I execute, I should have done this before I executed, but I haven't selected a kernel. So I mentioned that a kernel is the engine that runs all this code for me. And what I should have done, or what I had intended to do but forgot, is use the select kernel button up here. I'm still a little frazzled by doing about 10 minutes of recording that I then lost because it wasn't actually recording. So I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to select a kernel here. And what I want to do is, so an existing Jupyter server would be like a remote server if you want to connect and do this on a remote server somewhere. But I'm just going to choose from my Python environments. And on this particular machine, I have a couple choices here. I've got an older version of Python 3. I've got my 3.11.2, which is the one I've been using. That's kind of my default. And then I've got this Anaconda one. And for a Jupyter Notebook, I want to use the Anaconda. It's the sort of, you might see it referred to as the Conda base. And now let's try running that again. There we go. So despite my little misstep there, it's now working correctly. If I ever want to change my kernel again, I can just click that little select kernel button up in the corner and correct it or change it to whatever version I want. A couple other things about the user interface here as we're getting started with it. So whenever I have a cell selected, I have this little toolbar that comes up, so I can I can run line by line, which if you've done debugging before, that can be helpful, right? So if I want to run just one line, it'll run just the first line, and it's really helpful when you're trying to see where your code is broken. Go one line at a time. I can execute cells above or below. I can split the cell if I need to divide that code into two different spots. And then we've got a context menu that gives us a lot of useful stuff. And it probably is a little bit hard to see on the recording there, but I can cut, copy, and paste. I can insert. I can change this cell to markdown. And if I have a markdown cell selected, then obviously that is change cell to code. I can merge cells together. I can duplicate it down to the cell below. There's all kinds of useful user interface there for just a lot of the common things that we might need to do as we're working on a Jupyter Notebook file. And I did almost forget an important skill that you're going to need to know is what if I want to make a new notebook? Do I have to go into Jupyter Notebook and do that? You don't. You can make it right within Visual Studio. There are a couple ways. You can do it through the command palette if you wanted to, and you can sort of search for new notebook and create Jupyter Notebook. That will create one right there. You can also do it through the user interface. If you have a folder open, for example, like I do, you can, the same way you make any other file, just make sure you give it the correct extension. So I can say second notebook.ipynb. And we're right back in it. I'm going to change this cell to, is it a markdown already? I need to select my kernel again before I forget to do that. So, it's already got that from before. And oops, I'm going to change this cell to a markdown. My second notebook, and let that render. And so I can have as many notebook files as I need. I can keep them all in one folder or one place where I can maintain them easily and back them up easily if necessary, and deal with them just like any other file that I'm used to in Visual Studio. And that's ultimately the reason I'm doing it here. And at this point, you should be all set up now with both Jupyter Notebooks as an app with the Anaconda installation, and now being able to open and work with Jupyter Notebook files in Visual Studio Code. If you've had any problems, if you need any help with this, be sure and reach out to let me know.